FWN North. For those of you who joined us at the launch, we want to say thank you, and thank you for coming back again, because I can see some names who were in the first launch and they were here, and they are here now again. Today we are privileged to have our Member of Parliament for Leeds West, which is also where I'm based. So I'm a Leeds councillor, and I'm so pleased to welcome Rachel Reeves with us in the house today. Rachel is the Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and the Labour MP representing Leeds West. So Rachel, you're welcome. Thank you very much for being here. Do you just want to give them a wave? Right. Okay, with me as well is Dr. Sarah Hutchinson. Sarah, do you want to give them a wave?
Hi.
Sarah and myself are the two conveners of FWN North, and this is our second meeting, and we will be giving you more information about FWN North at the end of today. So while we have, whilst we have Rachel here, we have invited Rachel to actually talk to each and every one of us today about how Labour can look into the future and plan to rebuild our society following the pandemic. We are in very troubled times. We are in times that we have, I've never seen something like this since I was born. So many people, things have changed, people have gone, people are still in hospitals, lots of businesses have shut down, lots of businesses don't know what's gonna happen after the lockdown. As we speak, we still have businesses who do not know what they're gonna do going forward. We're receiving questions, we're receiving emails for clarifications, and we do not have the answers. Rachel, I know you're not gonna have every answer today, but we have every faith in you and your office to at least guide us. And that's what we would like to hear from you today. So over to you now.
Well, thank you very much, Abigail, and also to you, Sarah. I think it's so fantastic that you've set up the Fabian Women's Network North. I joined the Fabian Society not long after I joined the Labour Party, just over 25, yes, about 25 years ago now. And I think I was at the first ever event of the Fabian Women's Network that Seema Malhotra, who's now the Labour MP for Feltham and Heston, organised about 15 years ago. So I've got a long association, a very proud association with the Fabian Society, as well as, of course, the wider Labour movement. I'm going to talk about those issues that you mentioned shortly, Abigail, but I just wanted to start by some reflections on women in the Labour Party. And the first two women to serve in a British cabinet both represented northern constituencies. Both of them were Labour MPs, and that was Margaret Bonfield, who was the MP for Wallsend in Newcastle, and Ellen Wilkinson, who was from Manchester but went on to represent Middlesbrough and then Jarrow. And Margaret Bonfield was first elected in 1923 and Ellen Wilkinson in 1924. But next month is the 75th anniversary of Clement Attlee becoming Prime Minister in that landslide Labour victory. And that landslide Labour victory also ushered into Parliament, as well as Ellen Wilkinson, who was returned for Jarrow again, 5 other women who represented constituencies in the north of England for Labour. And that was Barbara Castle, of course, in Blackburn, Grace Coleman in Tynemouth, Alice Bacon in Leeds, Muriel Nicol in Bradford, and Bessie Braddock in Liverpool. And the reason I mention that is we have the 75th anniversary coming up of the government that created our National Health Service and our welfare state. But also that 1945 government, just 10 years earlier in 1935, the election before that, because of course elections were suspended during the Second World War, Labour was pretty much wiped out across the country, the worst defeat Labour had experienced. And it just goes to show that if you use your time in opposition well and you plan for the future and think about the future challenges that your country is going to face and the opportunities to rebuild it, you can come back stronger and better. And that's what we need to use the next 5 years to do. As Clement Attlee and Ellen Wilkinson and others did between 1935 and 1945, we now need to seize this moment and these opportunities to create a Labour Party that is better in touch with the country that we aspire to serve and has the answers for the challenge of 2024 when the next election is due. So let me address then the issues that you asked me to speak about this evening. We clearly face incredibly challenging times as a party and challenging times as a country. At the last general election, Labour had a worse result since 1935. We lost a whole host of MPs across the north of England, including many very talented Labour women. Anna Turley in Redcar, Jenny Chapman in Darlington, Paula Sheriff in Dewsbury, Mel On in Grimsby, and I could continue, because we lost a huge amount of talent and a huge number of talented Labour women in northern constituencies, particularly in our towns. And it is in our towns, our former industrial areas and our coastal communities that Labour has done worst in the last few years. And we need to understand why that is, rebuild trust among those people and in those communities, listen to what went wrong, to find out why the people whose forebears formed the Labour Party to give representation to working people have now turned in huge numbers against us. And if we have the humility to listen, I believe that we can win again in those constituencies and win again in the country and deliver the change that all of us joined the Labour Party and indeed the Fabian Society to deliver. But we also face huge challenges as a country because of what we're seeing and what we're experiencing at the moment. And Abigail spoke about the grief and the loss and the huge fears for the future that people are experiencing right now. We saw, and we have seen with coronavirus, that those people who are working on the front line have been applauded, they've been thanked, they've been termed the key workers, the underappreciated and the undervalued. 65,000 people and counting have died either directly or indirectly because of coronavirus. That is a tragedy for each and every family, particularly because in many cases they haven't been able to come together with funerals to grieve in the way that you would expect. One of my members in Kirkstall Ward lost her husband, had been married for decades. He was in a care home. She didn't see him in the 2 months before he died, and they weren't even able to have a proper funeral for him. And now she is alone in her home, grieving and on her own. And that is what this virus has done to people and has done to families. Pre-existing fragilities and inequalities have been exposed, I think, like never before. The fragility that so many people in our society experience social isolation and loneliness on a daily basis. And for them, in a way, the lockdown is nothing new, because in many cases, there are people in all of our communities who are alone and have nobody. But it's also exposed the fragilities in our social care system, a social care system which is incredibly fragmented, where nobody has overall control, and where the buck was passed in many ways by the government from hospitals to the social care setting, which was ill-equipped and ill-prepared to deal with what was coming. At the beginning of this virus, some people said it's the great leveller, because the virus doesn't discriminate between rich and poor, young and old, black and white. And yet that truth that people thought they spoke of at the beginning has been revealed to be an utter lie. Because the people who have been most exposed to this virus and where the deaths have been greatest are in our poorest communities and in our BAME communities. If you are black, you are 4 times more likely to die of coronavirus than if you are white. That can't be right. And it exposes a pre-existing inequalities of income and opportunity that already exist, but now we see more starkly than ever. Yesterday, Abigail attended a round table that I organised to look at the experience of the BAME community in my constituency in Leeds West, and I appreciate your time yesterday. Abigail, and it was an important opportunity for me to hear from people in my constituency who are experiencing now, but not just now, some of those inequalities that I've just spoken about. But for women too, this virus has exposed existing inequalities and injustices in society. More than 2/3 of people who work in the public sector are women. The majority of people who work in frontline roles, whether that is in the NHS or social care, whether it's in supermarkets, those jobs are predominantly done by women. And it has been women putting their lives and their health on the line every day, going to work throughout the coronavirus. No option of working from home if you work in intensive care. No option of working from home if you are a district nurse going from house to house. No option from working from home if you work in the checkout at a supermarket. Those are our key workers. And yet if you're a care worker, half of our care workers are paid less than a real living wage. A quarter of our care workers are on a 0-hour contract. Existing inequalities and injustices exposed by coronavirus. And these are all injustices and inequalities that an incoming Labour government in 2024 must address. There's also huge inequalities about who experiences domestic violence. That has always been the case, but we also know that domestic violence has increased during the course of this pandemic. The number of calls to the charity Refuge has increased by 66%. I'm the patron of Leeds Women's Aid, and I'm incredibly proud to do that and to work with them. They've created innovative ways for people to contact them without their partner knowing, even though they are locked up at home together. For many of us, the coronavirus, it's been inconvenient, but it hasn't been devastating. If you live with the people you love, in a home with a garden, and if you have a secure job, it's been inconvenient, but it's not been a disaster. If you live, as so many of my constituents do, in high-rise blocks of flats, and there are 26 of them in Leeds West alone, with an abusive partner and young children, this pandemic and the lockdown in particular has been devastating. Again, existing inequalities revealed and exposed by coronavirus. And women are more likely to be affected by the economics of all this as well. Childcare and schools have been closed for the vast majority of children during this crisis. And women are overwhelmingly the carers, whether it's the carers for older parents or for young children. And as a result, women have been struggling to work from home or to hold down jobs with all of the responsibilities that they have. There's a survey and an article I read in The Guardian that showed that working from home, fathers were likely to be able to work for 3 hours uninterrupted by their children, whereas mothers worked for just 1 hour uninterrupted by their children. All I can say is they've got better children than I do. But the point is that women do the majority of childcare. And if you're trying to hold down a job and look after children at the same time, it's incredibly difficult. And there is a risk now that our childcare sector is on the verge of collapse. And that after this crisis, as women attempt to return to work, they won't have the support with childcare to be able to do so. And that is something else that an incoming Labour government will have to address. We were woefully underprepared for this crisis. Now the government was saying, how can you prepare for something like this that none of us has ever experienced in our lifetimes? But the government had an opportunity to prepare for this. They carried out their own work, Operation Cygnus, which looked at what would happen and what you needed to do to prepare for a pandemic. The government refused to publish that work and those findings and refused to say what they did on the back of it. But we know when it comes to social care, when it comes to personal protective equipment and clothing, the government were woefully underprepared. But we were also underprepared and not resilient enough as a society. 38% of people went into this crisis with no savings to fall back on at all. Not by choice, but because they earned so little that it's impossible to put aside any money at the end of the month. In social care, as I say, half of people are not even paid a real living wage. They couldn't afford to isolate even if they had symptoms of the virus. They had to choose between being able to put food on their table and to protect their own health. And those are choices that nobody should have to make, but they're choices that people are having to make under this Tory government. How did we get into the position where we were unable as a nation to produce the personal protective equipment that our frontline workers desperately needed? And people died unavoidably because they didn't have the protection and the equipment to do their jobs, whether that was in hospital settings or in social care settings. Austerity meant that the state has been so cut back in the last 10 years that so many services at a local and national level were just not able to prepare and to be prepared for what was coming. The government have turned in many cases to the private sector, to Serco and to Deloitte and KPMG to deliver essential public services, rather than using what there is in the state, at local government and in Public Health England, because that is the predisposition of this government to almost turn to the private sector and to neglect and to undervalue public service and public servants. So we need to build back something better. After this crisis, we can't go back to a situation where our social care sector is so fragmented that nobody could organise and plan for a crisis like this. We can't go back to a world where half our social care workers are not paid a wage they can afford to live on, or have such insecurity in work because they are on a 0-hour or a short work contract. We can't one week clap for carers and the next go back to the way we treated them before. There are also some things that have come out of this crisis that we wouldn't want to change. Our sense of community, the way in which we value our neighbours and our family, the way we look out and check on people in our local community, do some shopping, knock on their door, make sure they're okay. Those sorts of things should continue after the crisis, and I hope as a nation we can continue with some of the best that we have learnt from all of this. Ideas, though, that were unthinkable one day now become the reality the next, and that was the same in 1945. When we went into the Second World War, I don't think anyone could have envisaged a national health service or the welfare state created by that Labour government under Clement Attlee and others. But by 1945, those crazy ideas, those inspirations became reality because of what had gone before. And we need to take this opportunity as well to build something better after this crisis. We have new leadership in the Labour Party, and our new leadership needs to work with the grassroots of our party, those in local government, those in constituency parties, those in our affiliated societies and socialist societies like the FWN Society. And if we work together and work with our MPs, including our northern MPs, then I believe that we can, as our forebears did in 1945, build something better in the wake of a crisis, and something that we in the Labour movement, but also as a nation, can be proud of. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. That was wonderful, truly grateful. Just to say, if anybody has got questions, we've got the Q&A on there, so you can type your questions and we will read them with the time that we have. We've got two already that have come in for you, Rachel. So I'll read the questions out and then you can help answer some. So there's one's come from a lady called Catherine. Now, Catherine says, my council has lost 80k revenue from rents and business rates since April. How can northern authorities avoid greater deficits under a brutal regime of cuts in local government?
Well, I mean, that is the experience as well. And I think that there's another question on a similar issue from Salma in Leeds. And I think Catherine and Sal are both right that local governments have been left to pick up the pieces during this crisis and haven't been properly supported by central government in doing so. And you point to the two ways in which income has been lost. One is because of the business rates and the other taxes that the local government apply, but particularly business rates. And second, the loss of income from the services that local authorities deliver, whether those be, for example, leisure services or parking fines, but those sorts of things, the revenue has totally dried up. At the same time, the expenses of local councils have gone through the roof as councils try and support people and businesses in the communities. And Robert Jenrick, who's obviously been in the news for his dodgy property deals with Tory donors, should have been spending more time speaking to council leaders than talking to Richard Desmond. And if he had have done that, and if he had put as much effort into bailing them out as he looked to bail out the billionaires, then I think we could be in a very different place today. The government have said that local authorities won't lose out, but that is not the experience so far. The government seem to be willing to compensate them for the extra costs incurred, but not for the loss of income. And that's not fair, because local authorities aren't able to borrow. They have to balance the books. And as a result, only government can come in and stand behind local authorities and help them through this crisis. And it would be an absolute travesty if after this crisis, local authorities were forced to cut services, because where would those cuts come? They would come in adult social care and children's social care. And we can't afford those cuts. And the lessons of this crisis is that we need more investment in those areas, not less investment. And so Steve Reed, who's our shadow spokesperson in communities and local government, has been making this case forcefully, and he's doing a brilliant job, I believe, as our shadow secretary of state for communities and local government, both on this issue and working particularly with Nick Forbes, the leader of Newcastle Council, who's also the Labour chair of the LGA, but also with Judith Blake, who's the LGA Labour group leader on education. And I was at a meeting that Kia chaired with Judith earlier this week, where we spoke about the challenges in getting more children back to school. And Kia and our leadership are absolutely determined to listen and work with those who are on the front line. It's really important where we've got Labour in power, in government, in cities like Leeds and in Manchester and Newcastle and in many local authorities across the north of England. We can learn from their experiences to now create something better and not to wait just until 2024. So I feel the pain both that Catherine and Salma have spoken about, and many of you who are on the front line in local government are experiencing at the moment. We'll push to make sure that there's a fair deal for local authorities.
Thank you very much, Rachel. So that's Salma and Catherine, similar questions. So I hope you're happy with Rachel's response. If not, just do let me know. We've got Kerry Foster, who's asking, why aren't we demanding an extension to Brexit? We could end up living without a deal in January. Back to you, Rachel.
Yeah, okay. So Kerry, in the last Parliament, I was one of the big supporters of a people's vote, and it wasn't always easy for me being in that place because my constituency, Leeds West, voted to leave the European Union, and I got quite a lot of backlash for that position. In the last Parliament, we were able to build alliances because the Conservatives lost their majority in Parliament. And it meant we were able to work with other opposition parties, but also with Conservative MPs like Dominic Grieve and Justine Greening and others who were unhappy with their own government's approach to Brexit. But the general election really changed all that. The Conservatives had a manifesto that essentially consisted of 3 words, and those 3 words were "Get Brexit Done." And on the back of that, they secured a majority of 80. And our position now in Parliament is very different to what we had before December last year. There are no alliances to be built. The Conservative MPs who have replaced those moderates that I mentioned, like Dominic Grieve and Justine Greening and Ken Clark and others, people who we wouldn't agree with on a huge range of things, but we were close to them in terms of our position on our membership of the European Union. They've gone now. They've been replaced by much harder line Conservatives. The EU and UK agreed last week that there was not going to be an extension to the transition period. And so that option is now behind us. That was the only opportunity in legislation that would enable an extension, and not just in UK legislation, but in EU treaty. So it's not going to be possible to get an extension now. But also, I think that the most important thing that Labour needs to do now is to focus on the substance of the form of deal that we want the Tory government to secure with the European Union. And what do I mean by that? Well, in their manifesto, the Conservatives said that it would be a deal with no tariffs, fees, charges or quantitative restrictions across all sectors of the economy. It was a deal that they said would enshrine workers' rights, consumer rights, animal welfare standards and environmental standards, that they would uphold the commitments in the Good Friday Agreement. And we now need to hold the government to those commitments that they made, not just to the European Union, but to the British people in that election which secured them that victory. So my focus and part of my role as Shadow Cabinet Office Minister is to shadow the government's Brexit policy. I shadow Michael Gove in Parliament, who is responsible for, among other things, our Brexit negotiations. And I want to hold the government to getting a good deal for our country, the good deal that they promised, the oven-ready deal that they promised at the general election. And if we spend all of our time talking about process, and an extension is a process argument, then we won't be heard on the more substantive points we want to make about the substance of a deal. In Parliament, Michael Gove wants to paint Labour all the time as a party, and the Tories do in general, as a party that hasn't accepted the result of the referendum, that hasn't accepted the result of the last general election, and continue to try and fight old battles. I'm determined to get Labour, and Keir Starmer is determined to get Labour in a new place, in a different place, where we accept the result, but demand that the deal secured is a deal that preserves that frictionless trade and the environmental, worker, consumer and animal welfare standards that were hard won. And if we spend our time arguing for an extension, that argument on the substance of the issue would be lost. I just also say this: there will be a deal at some point. Maybe it will be a WTO style deal, although I think probably it won't be quite that bad. But there will be a deal at some point. And whether that deal is secured at the end of this year or March next year or June next year, I don't think is the key point. I think the key point is what form that deal takes. And that is what I want to focus on when I shadow Michael Gove and when I take him on in the House of Commons.
Thank you very much. And we know you will take him on, definitely.
Too right.
Right. There's a question from Sarah Russell, and she says, you mentioned the nursery childcare sector and that we needed to be in a position to deal with it when we are in government in 5 years. How can we lead a more effective campaign to sustain it now?
Thank you, Sarah. It's such a challenge for people, providers of childcare. It's going to be a huge challenge with social distancing rules. It's going to be a huge challenge if parents decide not to send their children to early years provision. It's going to be a huge challenge if more people are out of work and can't afford the costs of childcare. So all of these things are going to put pressure on childcare providers, even when they are allowed to reopen. And so there does need to be a package of support, I think, for the childcare sector to get them through this crisis, because, you know, women's employment is, well, going into this crisis was a record high. Been huge changes in my lifetime in the number of women able to go to work and the variety of work that women were able to do. When I was at university, all of my friends that I lived with in my final year, all of our mums were teachers. And it's interesting that I think that was the case. But the work available for for women who were born in the 1940s and 50s and into the 60s were very limited, the sorts of jobs that you could go into. It wasn't that long ago that the marriage bar was abolished in some professions, but being able to balance work and family life required women to do a very narrow range of jobs. And I think there's a risk that we're going to go back to that if women have got to do the bulk of childcare as well as trying to hold down a job. And childcare, good childcare, is essential for women to be able to participate in the labour market in the way they want to. I think there are some positives and some things that we could look to that say, you know, this could be a better future, and that's things like working from home and greater flexibility for workers. I think that this has shown that employers should accept when people say that they want to work from home and they will do so productively. I think it's going to be very difficult for an employer to say in the future, no, it's so important, people have got to be present in the office. And that's an opportunity, I think, particularly for women who have a greater number of care responsibilities. And it's not just about children, actually, because you know, until a few years ago, my mum was the main carer for her parents, as well as helping me out with my first child, and at the same time she was a teacher. You know, that sort of thing is incredibly tough, but actually, and you can't do it in teaching so much, but working from home makes it a bit easier to balance some of those commitments. So I think there are some ways for you think this might be better for women, but your question was particularly about childcare, and we do need to ensure that if women can go back to work, and also if children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds are going to get a good start in life, that we need our childcare sector to survive and thrive in the years to come. And certainly in the short run, the government are going to need to put more support in there. Otherwise, I know this from my own experience in Leeds West, childcare providers are going to go to the wall, and that will be the responsibility of government if they do nothing to stop that.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. Now next to Ross Townsend. Now, Ross says, a recent report has been published showing that local governments suffered cost cuts vastly in excess of those suffered by the Conservative councils during the period from 2012 to the present day. How does the Labour Shadow Cabinet plan to highlight this discrepancy and hold the government to account for this shocking favouritism? And she said, thank you too.
Well, thanks very much for that question, Ros. And I mean, that is one of the things that Labour has been trying to do for the last 10 years. And one of the things which is, you know, perhaps most depressing about the seats that the Conservatives gained from Labour at the last election is many of them were in local authorities that had experienced some of the greatest cuts. And yet they didn't seem to blame the Conservative governments for that. Boris Johnson was very successful at disassociating himself with the last 10 years of Tory government and Tory austerity. We need to much closely attach Boris Johnson with the party that he represents and the party that is responsible for the austerity and the cuts to public services that we've seen over the last 10 years. But the Conservatives also got elected at the last election on an agenda of levelling up. And that levelling up agenda was particularly about levelling up those parts of the country that had felt left behind. So particularly our former industrial areas and our coastal communities, many of which had traditionally been, for a long period of time, many decades, in some cases for all of their existence, had always supported Labour and have now put their trust in another party. But part of that trust was on the commitment that Boris Johnson gave to level up, and we need to hold him to account on those things and set the bar high for what a real levelling up agenda would look like for places like Scunthorpe and Grimsby and Doncaster and Rother Valley and other places that we lost at the most recent election to the Tories. So I think it is important to hold them to those commitments. And Jim McMahon has been appointed by Keir to be the Shadow Minister for the Northern Powerhouse, as well as his role as Shadow Transport Secretary. And he did a really good interview with the Yorkshire Post a couple of weeks ago. And of course, he's also MP over in Oldham. But I hope as things start to return to some degree of normality, it'd be really good to get Jim to tour some of those northern constituencies that we lost to the Tories last year, to start to reconnect. And Keir has been doing these series of visits, virtual visits, called Call Keir on Thursdays, and he started them in Bury, where we lost our 2 parliamentary constituencies. One now has a Conservative majority of 104, so it's our most marginal seat, the seat that we most, that we win back before any other. But 2 seats in Bury, both with majorities for the Conservatives of I think less than 300. And so Keir has been visiting those seats. He went to Teesside as well to try and listen and start to rebuild back that trust. And certainly, I can be frank with you, because you're our friends, but the focus groups that we've been doing in those former Red Wall seats are pretty horrendous. And at the moment, there is no buyer's remorse. No one is saying, I voted Conservative, but I wish I hadn't. They still are putting their trust in Boris Johnson and the Conservatives, and they still feel very disillusioned about Labour and feel that we have left them. Not that they've left us, but that we've left them. And we need to do an awful lot of listening before we can claim that we've got the answers to the questions they're asking. And so I think these Call Keir events are really important. And as the lockdown restrictions are eased more, it'd be really important for Keir to get physically to these Red Wall seats and experience what things are like for people who are living in some of these northern towns and coastal communities, and what it is that has meant that they've left us, and for now at least, gone over to the Tories. So it's a massive challenge. No one, least of all myself and Keir, underestimate the scale of that challenge. But I do believe that we can win those voters back if we spend the time listening, not assuming that we know all the answers, and reconnect and rebuild that trust again.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Thank you very much, Rachel. We have another question from Joy Allen. And Joy says, Rachel touched on what a Labour government had achieved after the war, which most of the time had been incredible. Can we achieve this again, creating a health and care service that professionalizes the care workers and gives them a career structure, and recognize care is just as important as health? Many people are concerned more than ever about either themselves or family members.
I couldn't agree more with you. I wrote a pamphlet a couple of years ago called The Everyday Economy, and I spoke about the jobs that people do in all parts of the country in those sort of foundational sectors, those parts of the economy without which the rest of society and the economy wouldn't be able to function. And I spoke about health and social care, about distribution workers, about those who work in supermarkets, those who keep our lights on and our homes heated. And those jobs represent about 40% of the economy. And what they largely have in common is that they are underappreciated and undervalued. And we need to do much more to ensure better routes of progression, better quality of work, more security of work in those sectors of the economy. And one of the things I recommended was establishing a Royal College of Care, in the same way that we have a Royal College of Nursing and a Royal College of Midwives, etc. Let's have a Royal College of Care to recognise the skills and the experience that exists in our care sector, and ensure that they're properly represented so that they get the support and the opportunities that you get in other parts of our health and social care system. So as well as dealing with issues around pay and job security, I think there are also issues of status that we attach to certain jobs. And they are often, if we're honest, jobs that women predominantly do, that we afford a lower status. And that's been the case ever since Barbara Castle introduced the Equal Pay Act, because the people doing the sewing at the Ford Works in Dagenham were regarded as unskilled workers because they were doing women's work, and not men's work. And still, sadly, 50 years after the Equal Pay Act, we still have similar issues today, that often the work that women do and caring work is not valued as skilled in the way that that jobs by men are regarded as skilled. So I couldn't agree more with you. And I would just also make the point, I spoke about the creation of the National Health Service and the welfare state by that Labour 1945 government. But Ellen Wilkinson, when she was Minister for Education under Clement Attlee, she raised the school leaving age to 16. She introduced free school milk, and she started the introduction of free school meals. When Labour is in government, we can do amazing things. We did the same when Harold Wilson was Prime Minister, with the creation of comprehensive education, the Open University, the Race Relations Act, the Equal Pay Act and child benefit. And we did the same under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, where we established Sure Start, we rebuilt our hospitals and our schools. We introduced tax credits, the national minimum wage and the Good Friday Agreement. When Labour is in government, we achieve amazing things. And when we're not in government, we don't achieve anything. And so I'm determined, back in the shadow cabinet, to get Labour back on that route to victory, because it's only in power that we can change the lives of the people who all of us came into politics to serve.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Rachel. All right, sorry, just have a little glass of water. Sorry about all the questions, but
I feel like pouring it over my head. I'm boiling.
I know, we won't be too long. The sisters really need, as soon as they say it's Rachel, they want to ask you all the questions in the world. And we didn't want a situation where all you are going to do is just talk. We want any more interactive and they can get to ask you questions.
It's great. It's great. The other thing, I don't know what all you other women think, but spending all day looking at Zoom, when you're in meetings at work, you don't look at yourself all day. I hate it. You just sort of see your face, which is like glistening with the heat, and your fringe, which once was a normal length, is now covering your eyes and has to be moved to the side. But the sooner we can get away from Zoom meetings, the better. And I'd love to see you all in real life rather than in this way.
It will happen soon. Right. Okay. Next question is from Liz. Liz is asking, pub tenants are being charged rent by companies that are owned by billionaires. What can we do to help people that are facing going out of business because the government has not done anything or have not done whatever it takes to help them?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't quite catch it. That's about pub tenants, and pubcos, yeah. When I was before I was appointed to the shadow cabinet, I chaired in Parliament the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Select Committee, and one of the things that we looked at as a select committee was the behaviour of the pub companies, and we had the pubs code adjudicator come in, and I've had these issues in pubs in my constituency. The West End in Kirkstall and the Owl in Rodley have had problems with their landlords and the pub companies who own the business that they run. The pubs adjudicator was set up because of parliamentary pressure from MPs and what they experienced in their constituencies, but the government, I don't think, has given it the teeth that they need. And of course, these times, and I was speaking, I think it was yesterday, with small businesses in my constituency, including Kirkstall Brewery, who is an independent brewery based in Kirkstall in Leeds West, but really challenging times. He said to me that he was looking at the 80-page document about how to reopen pubs and bars and cafes and restaurants, and he's got to do all of that by July the 4th, but he absolutely has to reopen because for 3 months he's brought in no business, and in August, obviously, businesses will have to start paying some of the costs of employment as the furlough scheme comes to an end. So I think it's going to be a really challenging time for all of those who work in the hospitality sector. For a whole range of reasons. The rules the government have put in place, which, it's absolutely right, we've got to still keep some form of social distancing, but also there'll be a lot of hesitation. I'm not sure if I feel that comfortable about going into a pub or or a cafe or a restaurant right now, when the death numbers and the new infection rates are still so high. On the other hand, I want to support my local businesses, and I certainly think, on the 4th of July, we should, do what we can to support local, small, independent businesses who don't have the backings of these big companies standing behind them, and the reserves that they have. Many of these businesses, the business owners put everything into the business. It's their life, not just the business they run or a way of making a profit. And often smaller businesses, in the vast majority of cases, feel much closer to the people they employ than the bigger businesses that employ tens of thousands. And so, I think a lot of our pubs and restaurants, small ones, are going to be incredibly worried about what the next few months bring. And certainly when you've also got, a pub landlord who hasn't looked after your best interests over the last few years, I expect it's even more challenging time.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you very much. We've got another from Alison. Alison Hume says the inability for CLPs to hold formal meetings and campaign is really frustrating. Yes, Alison, I'm with you on that one. Very frustrating. As a women's officer in York, I've been running informal Zoom meetings to link up, but we really want to get campaigning on vital local issues. Do you know when the party will move from supporting the community to campaigning?
That's a really good question, Alison, and I know that a lot of people are frustrated about the challenges that this has posed to our everyday workers, Labour activists and members. I think that it's absolutely right that at the moment we don't meet in groups, because that would be going against all of the advice and would put ourselves and our families and our communities potentially at risk. And I don't think that would be a good look for the party. I think campaigning at the moment as well is going to be a challenge. Door-to-door campaigning and delivering of leaflets, I think is problematic while the virus is still with us. But hopefully, as the infection rate declines, if it continues to do so after all of the lifting of the lockdown restrictions that the government have put in place without proper test and trace system set up, but hopefully, in time we will be able to do that campaigning again. The party is also thinking about what campaigning will look like for the whole huge number of local elections, and in the case of Scotland and Wales, national elections next year. Obviously, we will have mayoral elections in the north of England. We will also have local council elections, police and crime commissioner. So, we need to get ready for those things, but it may be the case that we're campaigning in quite different ways. And I know that our regional office and our national organisers are thinking about the ways that we can do it in a safe way, but also potentially putting even more effort into our social media presence to get the message across in that way. And I think those sort of innovative forms of campaigning, which we've been using much more of anyway in the last few years, are going to become even more important in this election. And that is a challenge for us, because at the last election, and the Labour Together report set some of this out, the Tories hugely outspent us on social media. But not only did they outspend us, what they did was a lot better than what we did, and had a lot more cut through than we did. And so we've very quickly got to learn from some of the mistakes we made in 2019 in terms of digital content and really improve that if we're going to be any chance of level pegging with the Tories in our digital offer. I think the advantage that we have on the Labour side is our sheer volume of members compared with the Conservatives, many of whom are going to be much more digitally savvy than our Conservative counterparts, and we need to use that to our advantage, because people don't tend to look at the paid for promotions so much on social media, but they do look at stuff that their friends are posting and their friends are sharing. So we need to get better as a party of organically spreading that message on social media platforms, particularly Facebook, but also Instagram and to some extent Twitter as well, although I think that Twitter is not read so much by ordinary people. Facebook and Instagram are much better ways of communicating our message. But if we're not going to be able to do as much door-to-door campaigning, we're going to have to think about how we can do more online, but use our activist base to share those messages and those key messages that we want to get across at the local and national elections next May. But carry on, Alison, as I know you will be doing those informal things to keep morale going and keep people together. I meet every couple of weeks with our EC and our councillors on Zoom. I'm doing an event for new members. I think we've had about 300 new members in Leeds West since the last election. So I'm doing a new members event. I did one back in January in real life. I'm going to be doing one on Zoom in a couple of weeks' time. So I'm trying to do stuff with our members, but recognising that it's just going to have to be a bit different for now.
Thank you very much. Right, because we don't have so much time, there are two questions I would like to read out. And that's because they're from two sisters who are your councillors, Rachel, Julie Hesselwood, representing Bramley and Standingly, and also Lou Cunningham, representing Armley. So Julie says, hi Rachel, how will the Labour Party continue to merge physical meetings with virtual Zoom/team meetings to enable people, but especially women, to attend meetings and webinars and seminars? Women are still excluded from meetings and events due to childcare, cost of travel, and cost of childcare. We need to build this new way of meeting so women have more chance of participation. We ran a new menopause cafe last night in Leeds via Zoom, a new one in addition to our Leeds West group. So Jules has kind of answered some of it as well. So I'll quickly, because I'll read Lou's as well, so you can answer both at the same time. Lou says, as we come out of lockdown and see redundancies and unemployment rise in our communities, how are we going to deal with ensuring mental health problems which may emerge? So definitely that's going to be a very big one, especially with job losses. So how are we going to be able to deal with that as a party? Thank you.
Yeah, really, obviously brilliant questions from my Leeds West sisters. Jules's question. Yeah, look, all of us know that the Labour Party structures are not great for women, are they? Particularly women with caring responsibilities. And the whole format of our meetings, which can still be, if we're honest, pretty adversarial at times, not always that constructive, is often off-putting for women members who want to be doing something. They join the Labour Party because they want to make a difference and they want to do something useful, and they go along to their first meeting and lots of people are shouting at each other and trying to propose amendments to motions and look at the minutes of the last meeting. So we do need to find ways of making our Labour Party more welcoming and more inclusive of people from all different backgrounds in our Labour Party and our communities in all of their diversity. And I think Jules is absolutely right to challenge us on that. And actually, for some people, doing things on Zoom and being able to do things from home is a more inclusive way, and as a way that they've been able to participate that they perhaps couldn't come along at 7:30 on a Thursday evening to a community centre, but they could log in at home after the kids have gone to bed and not have to pay a babysitter. So I think we do need to find ways to use the technology we've been using in this crisis to keep that different form of engagement going. And also, as Alison said, do things like build women's groups locally, either in your CLP or across a number of CLPs. If you've got neighbouring constituencies you can work with. And I know, for example, in York Inner and York Outer work together, which is really great, especially when obviously only one of those has a Labour MP. And those of us who are in Labour seats, we need to work more with our friends and comrades in our neighbouring seats that don't have Labour MPs, because there are many of them in the north of England now that are without Labour representation in Parliament, and we need to support them. But you're absolutely right, Jules, that we should again take some of the positives from this virus about new ways of cooperating, working and communicating, and keep some of those going, because that will be more inclusive for some people. Lou spoke about mental health, and Lou is an absolutely fantastic counsellor in Armley, incredibly well plugged in our local neighbourhoods. And I did a roundtable with all of our GP surgeries in Leeds West a couple of weeks ago, and I thought that the main issues we would talk about would be coronavirus, but that wasn't the case. The main thing that the GPs wanted to talk to me about was a mental health crisis that they're experiencing now, and they know will be even greater as we start to emerge from this crisis, for all sorts of reasons, including, as Lou suggests, for the economic reasons. And it will be our poorest communities, places like Armley and Bramley, like Little London, where you are, Abigail, that will be worst hit by an economic downturn, because it is always the case that the poorest communities come out worse when there's a recession. And so we need to make sure that both we are have some sort of future jobs fund, like Labour introduced during the time of the financial crisis, to get people, and particularly young people, back into work, but also that we deal with the mental health. And it comes back to one of the things I said at the beginning. It's about revealing injustices and fragilities that already existed in society. We already had a mental health crisis in society, but this has exacerbated it and also brought it home to people, because people see the suffering in a way that perhaps they didn't before. And we need to have that parity of esteem and parity of funding between mental health and physical health, and also recognise that the two are closely intertwined as well. When your mental health is bad, your physical health deteriorates, and when your physical health is bad, your mental health deteriorates, and recognising that those two interact in a way that can make things much worse, but also in a way that if we tackle mental health problems, will also help deal with physical health problems as well. So thank you all for your brilliant questions. As usual, Fabian women are second to none in their understanding of their local communities and their commitment to make a difference. It's been lovely talking to you all.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Truly, truly appreciated. Sisters, I'm really sorry I will not be able to take all the questions, but what we could do, we might still be able to send them over to Rachel, and when we get the replies, we can send them.
I'll be very happy.
Yeah,
very happy to do that.
We can always email that to you. So thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you for telling us that one of the good things that has come out of this is our sense of community. It has brought a lot of us together. I mean, people that we never would have worked together with, all of a sudden we're doing that. So whilst we're still in lockdown, sisters, we'll continue Zooming. I'm not sure when we're going to see, but whilst we're still alive, we will continue to do whatever we can to make sure we keep our dreams alive. I will now hand over to my sister, Sarah, and Sarah is going to tell you the next steps for FWN North. So from me is thank you all so much, and thank you so much, Rachel, for joining us again. Truly appreciate it, and God bless you all. Thanks.
Thanks, Abigail, and thanks, Rachel. It's been a really brilliant event, and it's been great to see so many people involved in sending questions through. We are in the process of planning what's next for FWN North. We're hoping to hold before recess a members event, just so we can all have discussion amongst ourselves about what we want, about some of the things I think that we've been discussing today. I think there's obviously a very strong, our members have a lot to say, and I think we're really keen to hear that and think about how we use that enthusiasm to build something that can be really lasting and really quite powerful. So we will be sending information about that through. Do get in touch if, in the meantime, if you're wanting to get more involved. We've got a bit of an advisory group growing, and if you've got some time and energy and want to help us, let us know. Just contact us through the FWN main email address. FWN itself has some more great events planned over the next few weeks between now and parliamentary recess. Next Wednesday the 1st July, we've got Angela Rayner doing one of our Wednesday Wonder Women events. That's at 7:30. Tuesday the 7th July, we've got an event on domestic abuse, violence against women and COVID. It's chaired by our Vice Chair, Shaisa Aziz. We've got some really great panellists for that event, so it'd be well worth coming to. And then on Monday 13th July, we've got a new members event for new members of FWN with Seema Malhotra. So there's this, and then there's another Wonder Woman event which will be on regional and local government, which could be interesting given some of the questions that we've had here this evening. I think that's it. I think the only thing is, if you're interested in blogging for FWN, drop me a line through the FWN. We've started to put a number of blogs up, particularly around COVID-19, but we'll be relaunching Fabiana magazine at some point in the future, so get in touch. But I think just want to say thanks again to Rachel for joining us. It's been a really, really interesting evening. Thanks again to Abigail for chairing, but thanks to Katie, who's been helping us organise the Zoom and everything. It's Kelly, I think, who's been tweeting, but also to everybody who's joined us and is helping us build FWN North. So thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.